Well, have you ever heard the saying that power corrupts? Over the last few weeks, we've been in a series through the book of Judges, which is a collection of stories of deliverers that God raises up to rescue the nation of Israel from the enemy nations around them. And the reason why these deliverers were necessary is because of a cycle of sin that we've seen running through the whole book of Judges. This cycle is that Israel falls away from God and descends into idolatry, into the worship of the false gods of the nations around them. And when they do, God hands them over to these nations who begin to oppress them. And then when Israel is being oppressed and they're at their wits' end, then they finally remember to turn to God and cry out for a deliverer. But they only remain faithful to God as long as that deliverer or judge is alive. But as soon as they die, then they fall right back into idolatry again. But today we're going to see a bit of a shift in the judges that God uses to deliver Israel from their enemies. Beginning with the judge that we're looking at today, we're going to see a bit of a downward spiral within the judges themselves. We're going to see that instead of leading the nation of Israel back to God, the judges themselves start to fall into idolatry. We're going to see a trend where these judges don't really seem to be striving for God's glory as much as they are working for their own glory. And these stories are going to be a stark warning to us of the idol of self, against our human tendency to want to put ourselves in God's place and to start to work for our own glory, desires, and accomplishments instead of His. And we see this trend beginning with the character of Gideon, who we're introduced to in Judges chapter 6, verses 11 and 12. It says, "Then the angel of the Lord came and sat beneath the tree at Ophrah, which belonged to Joash of the clan of Abiezer. Gideon, son of Joash, was threshing wheat at the bottom of a winepress to hide grain from the Midianites. The angel of the Lord appeared to him and said, 'Mighty hero, the Lord is with you.'" Now, when we're first introduced to Gideon here in Judges chapter 6, we see that he has a really humble beginning. We find Gideon threshing wheat in a winepress. And this already gives us an indicator that something strange is going on, because a winepress is probably the last place that you would want to thresh wheat. Many of you, I'm sure, are aware that the process of threshing wheat is where you separate the edible grain from the inedible chaff, so that the wheat grain can be used for baking bread. And since they didn't have combines back in Gideon's day, this all had to be done by hand, by throwing wheat stalks up in the air and hitting them on the ground to break the grain kernels away from the chaff. It was a very labor-intensive activity. And so it was normally something that you would want to do out in the open where you had lots of space. But here we see that Gideon is doing this in a winepress, in a small, confined space. And we're told that he's doing this because he wants to hide from the Midianites. Now, the Midianites were one of those opposing nations around Israel. And if we read earlier in chapter 6, you'll see that the Israelites had again done evil in the sight of the Lord. They had fallen into idolatry again, into worshiping the false gods of the nations around them. So God had handed them over to the Midianites, who have now been oppressing them for 7 years. And that is why Gideon is hiding in a winepress. But this also makes the Lord's address to Gideon really ironic in verse 12. In verse 12, the angel of the Lord appears to Gideon and calls him a mighty hero, or some other translations say a mighty warrior. But that's not the way you would expect God to address someone who's hiding from their enemies. So far in Judges 6, Gideon seems to be anything but a mighty hero. Gideon responds in verses 13 to 15 by saying, "Sir," Gideon replied, "if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? And where are all the miracles our ancestors told us about? Didn't they say the Lord brought us up out of Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us and handed us over to the Midianites." Then the Lord turned to him and said, "Go with the strength you have and rescue Israel from the Midianites. I am sending you." "But Lord," Gideon replied, "how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in the whole tribe of Manasseh, and I am the least in my entire family." Now that response doesn't really sound like someone who knows and loves the Lord their God with all of their heart, soul, strength, and mind. In fact, Gideon's first response to God in verse 13 is to question whether he is even still present with the people of Israel. He says, "If the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? And where are all the miracles our ancestors told us about?" We see here that Gideon has quite a bit of doubts. Doubts about who God is and his plan for the nation of Israel. And also doubts about himself and whether he can truly be used by God. In verse 15, we see that Gideon tries to disqualify himself by saying that his clan is the weakest in his whole tribe, and that he is the least of his family. And this is a reminder to us that we are called to live by faith and not by sight. Because on the one hand, we can kind of see where Gideon's doubts would come from, because he has seen the Midianites oppressing his people for 7 years. And he himself is so fearful of the Midianites that he's hiding from them in a winepress. But we also know that Gideon is aware of how God has come through for Israel in the past. In verse 13, he references how the Lord brought them out of slavery in Egypt and to the promised land of Canaan, where they were now living. We know that Gideon has grown up hearing stories about the great things that God has done for Israel. And so he really doesn't have an excuse to be turning away from God and to doubt whether God can come through for Israel once again. What Gideon shows us is that our present difficulties are not proof of God's inaction or inability. Because our God never changes. He's the one who was, and who is to come. And since he has always been faithful in the past, we can trust him to always be faithful in the future. But something else that we see in Gideon's story is that if we want to be used by God, then we need to commit ourselves to him wholeheartedly and even clean up a few things in our lives. In verses 25 through 27, it says this: "That night the Lord said to Gideon, 'Take the second bull from your father's herd, the one that is 7 years old. Pull down your father's altar to Baal and cut down the Asherah pole standing beside it. Then build an altar to the Lord your God here on this hilltop sanctuary, laying the stones carefully. Sacrifice the bull as a burnt offering on the altar, using as fuel the wood of the Asherah pole you cut down.' So Gideon took 10 of his servants and did as the Lord commanded. But he did it at night because he was afraid of the other members of his father's household and the people of the town." What we see here is that this issue of idolatry, this issue of worshiping the false gods of the nations around them, was not just an issue for Israel corporately, but it was also an issue for Gideon personally. Because there was an altar to Baal right in Gideon's backyard. And before Gideon could be used by God to redeem Israel, he first had to deal with the idols that were in his own backyard. And this reminds us that we can't serve two masters. We can't worship God and the things of this world at the same time. And while none of us probably have altars to Baal or Asherah poles in our backyard, there are tons of other idols vying for our attention in our society today. Things like our careers, our wealth, our sexuality. And perhaps the most common idol in our world today is actually the idol of self. Our society is largely characterized by this thinking that we are the source of our own truth and fulfillment, that we should just follow our heart and make up our own truth, because ultimately meaning, purpose, and fulfillment comes from within ourselves. But the problem with this is that when we think this way, then we're putting ourselves in the place of God. And that will always be a hindrance to our relationship with the Lord. And so we see that Gideon obeys God's command and tears down this altar to Baal. But he does it at night because he's afraid of the other members of his father's household and town. And while it's easy to find fault here in Gideon's actions, I think a lot of us can probably relate. Because many of us have family members who aren't followers of Jesus. And that can often cause tension because we're living out of a very different worldview, even sometimes compared to other people in our own household. And that's something that Jesus actually warns us of in the Gospels. In Luke chapter 12, he says this, "I have come to set the world on fire, and I wish it were already burning. I have a terrible baptism of suffering ahead of me, and I am under a heavy burden until it is accomplished. Do you think I have come to bring peace on earth? No, I have come to divide people against each other. From now on, families will be split apart, 3 in favor of me and 2 against, or 2 in favor of me and 3 against." What Jesus shows us here is that being his disciple means that we are called to live set apart from the world around us. And not only will that affect our relationships with our friends and colleagues, but it could even impact our relationships with our family members as well. This issue of being called to live in the world and yet set apart from it is definitely a real source of tension in the life of a believer. And truly, I think it's the hardest part of being a disciple of Jesus. But we can take courage in the fact that we know that God works all things for the good of those who love him and who are called according to his purpose. We know that God is with us and for us. And so even in these difficult and often tense situations, we can know that God will lead us with both grace and truth. Coming back to Gideon's story in Judges 6, we read this in verses 36 to 40. "Then Gideon said to God, 'If you are truly going to use me to rescue Israel as you promised, prove it to me in this way. I will put a wool fleece on the threshing floor tonight. If the fleece is wet with dew in the morning, but the ground is dry, then I will know that you are going to help me rescue Israel as you promised.' And that is just what happened. When Gideon got up early the next morning, he squeezed the fleece and wrung out a whole bowlful of water. Then Gideon said to God, 'Please don't be angry with me, but let me make one more request. Let me use the fleece for one more test. This time let the fleece remain dry while the ground around it is wet with dew.' So that night God did as Gideon asked." Important not to get those two mixed up. "The fleece was dry in the morning, but the ground was covered with dew." Now this passage about Gideon's fleece is probably the most famous part of his whole story. And it's often described as simply being a way in which Gideon is trying to clarify and discern God's call on his life. But the problem with that interpretation is the fact that Gideon already knows what God is calling him to do. Back in verse 14, God made it clear that he was calling Gideon to rescue Israel from the Midianites. So if Gideon already knows what God wants him to do, then why is he asking God to prove himself with the fleece test? Jesus says in the Gospels that it is a wicked and adulterous generation that asks for a sign. If we approach God with this posture, where we are open to his direction in our life, and where we want to yield to him, then we shouldn't need to test God the way that Gideon is. We should just be able to take God at his word. What we see here is that while Gideon is following God, he's not exactly doing it with the right intention. He's not doing it wholeheartedly. And we're going to see the fallout from that after the battle in chapter 7. Chapter 7 chronicles a battle that Gideon leads against the Midianites. A battle where God takes Gideon's army of 32,000 men and whittles it down to just 300. God chooses to use only a fraction of Gideon's army because he wants to make it clear to everyone that it is his hand that is supernaturally delivering the Israelites from the Midianites. The Israelites' victory is not just the product of their own skill and prowess as warriors. But we're also going to see that this victory seems to go to Gideon's head a little bit. While Gideon starts off as a timid man hiding in a wine press in chapter 6, we're going to see that he turns into a bit of a tyrannical ruler in chapter 8. In Judges 8, verses 4 to 7, we read this. Gideon then crossed the Jordan River with his 300 men, and though exhausted, they continued to chase the enemy. When they reached Succoth, Gideon asked the leaders of the town, "Please give my warriors some food. They are very tired. I'm chasing Zebah and Zalmunna, the kings of Midian." But the officials of Succoth replied, "Catch Zebah and Zalmunna first, and then we will feed your army." So Gideon said, "After the Lord gives me victory over Zebah and Zalmunna, I will return and tear your flesh with thorns and briars from the wilderness." Now, I don't know about you, but that seems a little harsh. And the reason why these men at Succoth are hesitant to support Gideon is because they're afraid of getting on the bad side of the Midianites just in case Gideon loses. And so they want to wait until after Gideon has captured Zebah and Zalmunna and until the battle is completely finished before they offer their support to either side. And really, these guys are acting quite a bit like Gideon himself back in chapter 6, when he was hiding from the Midianites in a wine press and was doubting God's presence and provision over Israel. But we also see that Gideon's response is extremely harsh. He threatens to return and beat them with thorns and briars from the wilderness, a threat that he later follows through with. And not only that, but verses 15 to 18 also tell us that he proceeds to kill all the men in the village of Succoth as well. What we see here is that Gideon's response is far greater than what the men in Succoth deserve. And he actually winds up treating the people of Succoth, who are themselves Israelites and his own people, even more harshly than he treats the Midianites, who God had called him to deliver Israel from. And there's also no mention of God at all in Judges chapter 8. There's no indication that God is influencing any of Gideon's decision-making. Instead, Gideon just seems to be operating out of his flesh, out of his sinful nature. He's taking personal offense to these officials in Succoth and is seeking vengeance. And Gideon's response to these guys kind of reminds me of something that the Apostle James says in James chapter 3. He says, people can tame all kinds of animals, birds, reptiles, and fish, but no one can tame the tongue. It is restless and evil, full of deadly poison. Sometimes it praises our Lord and Father, and sometimes it curses those who have been made in the image of God. Gideon's reaction to the men of Succoth reminds us that we need to wash our mouths. Because if we're not careful, it's really easy to say things and do things that we later regret. And if we don't first go to God and ask Him to lead and guide our thoughts and reactions, then it's often really easy to overreact to situations and escalate conflicts. Something that I'll sometimes do is I'll try and go into conversations prayed up. If I know there's a situation where I'm likely to get agitated and angry, sometimes I'll go to the Lord in prayer first and ask for Him to lead my responses and guide my reactions. Because Gideon and the Apostle James show us that followers of Jesus really do need to tame their tongues. That self-control is one of the fruits of the Spirit, and not learning to exercise it can really do a lot of damage in our lives. But unfortunately, Gideon's temper is not the only problem that distances him from God. In verses 22 to 27, it says, Then the Israelites said to Gideon, Be our ruler. You and your son and your grandson will be our rulers, for you have rescued us from Midian. But Gideon replied, I will not rule over you, nor will my son. The Lord will rule over you. However, I do have one request, that each of you give me an earring from the plunder you collected from your fallen enemies. The enemies, being Ishmaelites, all wore gold earrings. Gladly, they replied. They spread out a cloak, and each one threw in a gold earring he had gathered from the plunder. The weight of the gold earrings was 43 pounds, not including the royal ornaments and pendants, the purple clothing worn by the kings of Midian, or the chains around the necks of their camels. Gideon made a sacred ephod from the gold and put it in Ophrah, his hometown. But soon all the Israelites prostituted themselves by worshiping it, and it became a trap to Gideon and his family. Here we see that the people of Israel want to crown Gideon as their king because of his victory over the Midianites. And while Gideon does not want to be their king, he still wants to tax them the way that a king would. He doesn't want the responsibility of leadership, but he does want the benefits of leadership. But the real issue here is what Gideon does with the gold that he collects. Verse 27 tells us that he uses it to make a sacred ephod. And then he brings this ephod to his hometown, where it becomes an idol that he and others worship. And there's a few things here that are all very wrong and way off course from what God wants from his people. Firstly, Gideon has no business wearing an ephod or making an ephod. An ephod is a special vest worn by the priests in Israel while ministering in the tabernacle. The instructions for making an ephod are recorded in Exodus chapter 28, where Aaron, the brother of Moses, becomes the first high priest in Israel and the first one to wear an ephod. But Gideon is not a high priest. He's a judge or a military leader. And so he has no business handling a sacred object meant to be used in worship in the tabernacle. But even worse is the fact that Gideon uses this ephod for idolatrous purposes. Instead of aiding the Israelites in their worship of God and God alone, the people in Ophrah start to worship the ephod itself. This ephod basically becomes like the golden calf in Exodus 32 that the Israelites were worshiping and dancing around. Verse 27 says, "But soon all the Israelites prostituted themselves by worshiping it, and it became a trap for Gideon and his family." And the wording here about Israel prostituting themselves to the ephod and worshiping it might seem kind of strange to us. But that kind of language for idolatry is actually very common in the Bible. In other places in the Old Testament, Israel is referred to as an adulterous woman who has left God, her husband. And in the New Testament, the church is often referred to as being the bride of Christ. And the significance of that is it shows us that when we fall into idolatry, when we put other things in the place of God and start to worship and serve created things rather than the Creator, then what we're basically doing is we're cheating on God. It makes God feel as though we are committing adultery, and it really does break his heart. Understanding that is crucially important because it shows us that idolatry is not just a small problem. It's actually a really big problem. So as we end our service today, I'd like to ask you if there are any idols in your backyard that you need to tear down. Like Gideon, it can often be very easy for us to forget about God during times of prosperity, times when everything is going our way and we feel like we're getting what we want. In those seasons, we can sometimes forget that the Lord truly is our provider and sustainer. We can maybe start to think that it's our own ingenuity and our own skill that has gotten us this far. But what we see in Gideon's story is that when we worship ourselves in this way, then we're not operating for God's glory, but instead for our own. And ultimately, that's only going to lead us further and further away from Christ. Instead, we need to take radical action against self-worship and tear down the idols that are in our own backyard. Amen?